Meet Greta Evans, a regular woman, hops over to the UK to work as a nanny for a rich family. When she reaches their fancy house, the owner's not around, so she takes off her shoes and explores. Suddenly, a local delivery guy named Malcolm appears and offers to show her around. Not long after, an elderly lady, Mrs. Heelshire, who owns the place, arrives. She asks about Greta's missing shoes, thinking it might be her son's doing. Then, Mrs. Heelshire introduces Greta to her husband, Mr. Heelshire, and the child Greta's supposed to babysit. But, surprise, it's not a child. It's a porcelain doll named Brahms. Greta laughs, thinking it's a prank, but Mr. and Mrs. Heelshire are dead serious. They tell Greta that Brahms rejected many other nannies because they weren't young or pretty enough. They lay down some strict rules for Greta, like reading to Brahms loudly, playing loud music, and even setting Musa traps. They even want her to give Brahms a goodnight kiss. They say Brahms is shy and only moves when no one's watching. Then, they ask Brahms what he thinks of Greta, and things get pretty strange. The next day, Greta hears Mrs. Heelshire, who's upset because Brahms' room is a mess. Then, Mr. Heelshire shows up, saying they're going on vacation, leaving Greta alone with Brahms. He hands her a schedule for the upcoming days. Once they're gone, Greta starts breaking the rules, leaving Brahms on his own. One night, she wakes up to strange sounds, and as she investigates, she has a scary nightmare where a hand comes out of the wall to strangle her. But it's just a bad dream. Greta checks on Brahms and notices tears in his eyes. It turns out the ceiling is leaking. That night, Greta gets a mysterious phone call with silence on the other end. In the morning, Malcolm delivers groceries, and Greta asks him about Brahms. Malcolm reveals that Brahms used to be a real boy, the Heelshire's only child. Their house caught fire, and Brahms didn't make it out in time. He died. The doll is a way for the family to cope with their loss. Malcolm asks Greta out on a date, and she agrees. While she's getting ready, she sees Brahms watching her and closes the door. When she finishes showering, she's shocked to find her hair cut, and her dress and necklace missing. She searches for them, but eerie noises lure her to the attic. The attic ladder mysteriously closes, trapping her inside. Malcolm comes to pick up Greta, but she can't get his attention, so he leaves. Greta looks for another way out and is terrified by a looming shadow. She faints, but when she wakes up, she's miraculously free. She tells Malcolm what happened, and they discuss Brahms. There are two rumors in town. Some feel sorry for him, remembering him as a good boy, while others think he was evil. Later that night, Greta calls her sister once again. She learns that her abusive ex-boyfriend, Cole, has been trying to track her down, and she despises him for the pain he's caused her, including a miscarriage she suffered due to his violence. After preparing for bed and brushing her teeth, Greta hears a strange noise coming from Brahms's room. She cautiously investigates and finds it in disarray, with papers scattered around. She fixes Brahms's tilted head, but then it moves on its own, turning out to be just a nightmare. The next day, Greta goes back to Brahms' room and sees that he's changed his position. He's sitting next to her schedule, as if urging her to follow it to the letter. This shocks Greta, and she hurries to her room to call her sister. When she answers the phone, a child's voice instructs her to follow the rules, and a shadow appears under the door, confirming that the doll holds many more secrets than she first thought. The doll is alive. Greta opens the door and finds a tray of sandwiches that Brahms has left for her. This leaves her with mixed emotions. It becomes clear that Brahms doesn't intend to harm her. He simply craves her attention. She calls Malcolm to share what's happening, but he doesn't take her seriously. In a subsequent scene, we discover a heartbreaking letter from Mr. and Mrs. Heelshire addressed to Brahms. The letter reveals their despair at what Brahms has become, and they decide to take their own lives by filling their coats with rocks. They believe that Greta is now responsible for Brahms. Greta, realizing that Brahms is merely the spirit of an innocent young boy longing for care, begins to treat him with kindness and follows the tasks entrusted to her. The next day, Malcolm arrives with a letter from the Heelshires, and he invites Greta for an evening walk. However, Greta now feels a sense of responsibility for Brahms and declines Malcolm's offer. Disappointed, Malcolm departs. Greta is then taken aback when she witnesses Brahms moving on his own. The following day, she asks Malcolm to come over to demonstrate that Brahms is indeed alive. Initially, she fails to prove it because the doll only moves when no one is watching. So, she decides to leave the doll unattended, and it finally moves. Eventually, Malcolm starts to believe her. That night, Malcolm stays with Greta, and they enjoy their time together. However, their activities are interrupted by Brahms, who appears to be jealous. They have a conversation in the kitchen, and Malcolm opens up about a more detailed story regarding Brahms's death. As a child, Brahms used to play with a girl his age named Emily Cribbs. On Brahms's 8th birthday, Emily visited the Heelshire mansion to play with him and never returned. Tragically, her lifeless body was found in the woods with a crushed skull. When the police arrived to question the young boy, the mansion was already in flames, and Brahms was later found dead. Malcolm concludes that the spirit residing in the doll, which is Brahms, might have sinister qualities. In the morning, Greta's abusive ex-boyfriend, Cole, shows up at the mansion with the intention of forcibly taking Greta back with him. For Greta's safety, Malcolm stays close by. When night falls, Greta reaches out to the doll for help. Cole wakes up and finds a message written in blood, urging him to leave. Believing either Greta or Malcolm to be responsible, he becomes furious. Greta tries to explain that Brahms used rat blood to write the message, but he refuses to believe her. Eventually, Malcolm joins them in their effort to convince Cole that the doll is more than it seems. Cole, overcome by anger, smashes the doll to pieces. This triggers a series of eerie events in the house. The lights start flickering, the house shakes, and strange noises come from behind the walls. Cole attempts to locate the source of the noises. Suddenly, a mirror shatters, and Cole is thrown back. From a hole behind the shattered mirror, a man emerges, revealing himself as the real adult Brahms, wearing a porcelain mask identical to the doll's face. Brahms attacks and kills Cole. Frightened, Malcolm and Greta flee for safety. They venture into Brahms' room, where they discover a doll made from Greta's missing dress, hair, and jewelry on Brahms' bed. It becomes clear that Brahms has been secretly observing Greta all along. Greta also finds a farewell letter from the Heelshires, outlining their plan to leave Greta behind as a companion for Brahms. Brahms locates them, knocking out Malcolm and threatening to kill him unless Greta stays. Greta takes action, using a screwdriver to enforce the rules, compelling Brahms to bed. He asks for a goodnight kiss, but when he tries to kiss her, she stabs him. Brahms attempts to strangle her, but she pushes the weapon in deeper, causing him to collapse. Greta rescues Malcolm, and they manage to escape the house. In the final scene of the film, we see Brahms piecing the doll back together, suggesting that he is still alive. This leads us to the conclusion that Brahms never died in the first place. He was a disturbed child who, on his 8th birthday, committed a terrible act by killing Emily Cribbs. To protect him from the outside world, his parents set their own house on fire, faked his death, and hid him within the walls of their grand mansion. The tragic suicide of Mr. and Mrs. Heelshire was likely a result of their overwhelming guilt, outweighing their love for their troubled child, leading them to end their suffering. Throughout the movie, there are subtle hints that build up to this major revelation. In the beginning, Mrs. Heelshire mentions that Brahms enjoys loud music, suggesting that he can hear things from within the walls. The Heelshires are also very particular about keeping their home free from pests, emphasizing the importance of maintaining clean mouse traps to prevent creatures from entering the walls. Their insistence on saving uneaten food strongly implies that it was meant for Brahms. Mrs. Heelshire's statement that Brahms only moves when no one is watching reveals that the doll was never moving on its own. It was being manipulated by the real Brahms residing within the walls.